student, welcome to Massive Open Online course on Indian economy. Today I am going to discuss the module entitled Economic Growth and Growth of Employment and Employment Elasticity of Output. After completing this module, you are able to know the theoretical relationship between growth of employment and growth of GDP. It also helpful to understand the trends of growth of GDP, growth of employment, growth of labor productivity, as well as this module is also helpful to understand the nature of growth of Indian economy by the means of output elasticity of employment. The module consists with 7 sections. Section 1 introduces the theme, whereas section 2 deals with the theoretical relationship between growth of GDP and growth of employment. Section 3 describes the trend of per capita income, employment and labor productivity in Indian economy, whereas section 4 and 5 describes the trends of growth of employment, growth of per capita GDP as well as the growth of labor productivity. And section 6 deals with the employment elasticity of output that helpful to understand the nature of growth of the Indian economy. And finally, section 7 makes some concluding observations. It is true that the per capita GDP and employment, these two are important factors to understand the nature of the economy. Side by side, it is also equally important to understand the nature of progress of the economy by the growth of GDP as well as growth of employment. And this employment is also acts as a relationship between or link between growth rate, that is growth of output, and poverty reduction. Side by side, it is also important that this employment or generation of employment is also important to understand the nature of development, that is whether the development is inclusive or sustainable or not. After the implementation of the economic reforms, Indian economy has experienced very high growth rate of per capita real GDP. During the period of 93-94 to 2011-12, the per capita real GDP increased by 244% in India. And not only that, the Indian economy also able to overcome the distress condition or decelerated condition triggered by the global economic crisis in 2008-9 or the crisis due to COVID-19 pandemic in the year 2020 and 21. But the growth of employment was relatively low during the first decades after implementation of economic reform, that is during the period of 93-94 to 2011-12, Indian economy has experienced a growth rate of employment by 26%, which is very, very low compared to the growth rate of real per capita GDP. Therefore, to understand the nature of growth of the Indian economy, here we considered output elasticity of employment that are helpful to understand the nature of growth of the Indian economy. Against this backdrop, the present module are effective to know the trend of growth of output, growth of employment as well as employment elasticity of output of Indian economy. Section 2 that is the theoretical relationship between growth of output and growth of labor productivity. If we consider that there is no deficiency of aggregate demand, side by side fixed coefficient of production which may change over time due to technological progress, then the growth rate of employment is determined by the difference between growth rate of output and growth rate of labor productivity. That is, the growth rate of employment is the function of the difference between growth rate of output and growth rate of labor productivity, which is denoted here that GE means growth rate of employment, which is the function of the difference between G minus GLP. Here G is the growth rate of output. growth rate of output is simply calculated as yt minus 1 by yt minus 1, and which is equal to S by C. S means propensity to save, whereas C is the capital output ratio. Similarly, GLP denotes the growth of labor productivity, which is the function of the technological progress, and more technological progress implies more growth of the labor productivity. Now, the growth rate of employment is greater than equal to 0 if the growth rate of output is greater than the growth rate of labor productivity, and higher the gap between G and GLP, that is growth rate of output and growth rate of labor productivity, higher will be the growth rate of employment. Along with this, if we consider the Kaldor-Verden formulation, where the Kaldor postulated that the growth of labor productivity is directly and linearly depend on the growth of output. That is, in his specification, GLP equal to A plus BG. Here B is the positive, it lies between 0 and 1. That indicates that the growth of labor productivity and growth of output are directly related. Now, along with this consideration, if we consider the growth rate of employment, which is the difference between growth rate of output and growth rate of labor productivity, then after simplification, the GE equal to minus A plus 1 minus B into G. That is, growth rate of employment is also directly depends on growth rate of output if and only if this particular coefficient that is 1 minus B is positive. 1 minus B is positive means B is less than 1. If B is less than 1, then there is also the direct and linear relationship between growth rate of employment and growth rate of output. Now, this relationship between growth rate of employment and growth rate of output can be explained with the help of this diagram. This is a specific diagram that helps us to understand the relationship between growth rate of employment and growth rate of output. If you consider in an economy where there is a scope of the increase of the labor productivity, before going to discuss the logical relationship, here we have mentioned the two color, one is white, another is blue. White means the previous situation and blue color implies the changed situation. Therefore, here labor productivity increases, that implies that in an economy, if there is a situation of the increase of the labor productivity, that can be gained by the capitalist, and they are directly influenced to increase the rate of profit, which is measured by pi by y. That is, pi by y increases due to increase of the labor productivity, and this increased rate of profit also leads to increase the savings income ratio S by y in the economy. S by y is denoted as small s. Small s means propensity to save. Now, if you consider the fixed coefficient of production, that is, if C by y equal to constant, which is equal to C, then the growth rate of output, which is measured by S by C also increases due to increase of the propensity to save, that is due to increase of the S by y or small s, because C is constant, denominator is constant. As S increases in the numerator, therefore growth of output also increases, and this increase of the growth of output influences on the growth rate of employment. As growth rate of employment directly depends on the growth rate of output, therefore growth rate of employment also increases, and this reduces the unemployment rate of the economy. This is the typical relationship between labor productivity as well as growth rate of output and growth rate of employment. Now, we discuss the trend of per capita GDP, labor productivity and employment in the Indian economy. Here we have considered two periods, one period from 93-94 to 2011-12 and another period from 2011-12 to 2020-21. During the first period, that is during the first 2 decades of the economic reform, that is 93-94 to 2011-12, both per capita income, that is per capita GDP, which is measured by GDP by P, here mentioned in the brown color, and labor productivity, that is average productivity of labor, that is measured by GDP by employment or GDP by labor, which is mentioned here by the blue color, both are showing upward trend. The per capita income increased from 17,033 in the year 93-94 to 42,720 in the year 2011-12. Similarly, the labor productivity, average productivity of labor also increased from 40,683 in the year 93-94 to 1,10,881 in 2011-12. That is, both per capita GDP as well as labor productivity were showing upward trend during this period. This diagram helps us to understand the trend of per capita GDP as well as labor productivity during the latter period 2011-12 and 2020-21. During this period, here the base year is 2011-12, whereas the previous period, that is 93-94 to 2011-12, the base year is 2004-5. Therefore, these two are not directly comparable. Rather, we can understand the trend of the labor productivity as well as per capita GDP in the latter period, that is 2011-12 to 2020-21 in this diagram. Here the both trends, that is the trend of per capita GDP as well as the labor productivity, were also showing the upward trend. But during the recent years, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, both growth of output, both the value of the per capita GDP as well as labor productivity decreased during the recent years, that is during 2021. This lower diagram helps us to understand the trend of rate of employment, which is measured by the ratio of the employment to population, which is also called worker population ratio, which is an important indicator to understand the generation of the employment in an economy. From this diagram, it is evident that this rate of employment or worker population ratio fluctuated from one year to another year. It is fluctuated from 0.42 in the year 93-94 to the minimum value 0.35 in the year 2017-18. But during the recent years, the rate of employment gradually increases, and it increased from low value as 0.35 in 2017-18 to 0.40 in 2021 during the recent years. Now section 4. Section 4 deals with the trend of growth rate of per capita GDP or growth rate of labor productivity as well as growth rate of employment. Here the blue bars indicate the growth rate of GDP, the pink bars indicate the growth rate of labor productivity, whereas the red bars indicate the growth rate of employment. From here, it is evident that the growth rate of labor productivity and growth rate of GDP are directly related. This can be understood if we look into the figures that in the period 93-94 to 99-2000, the growth rate of GDP was 8.2%, whereas the growth rate of labor productivity was 6.9%. And both this growth rate deteriorated in the next period, that is 99-2000 to 2004-5, where the GDP growth of GDP decreased to 5.7% per annum, whereas growth of labor productivity also decreased to 2.7%. And in the next period, that is 2004-5 to 2007-8, both the growth rate significantly improved, and during the entire period, both the growth rates seem to be the higher. But during the period of economic slowdown, that is 2008-9 to 9-10, the growth rate of employment as well as labor productivity also relatively high, and not only that, the growth rate of labor productivity is also higher than the growth rate of employment. This indicates that there is a direct relationship between growth rate of labor productivity and growth rate of per capita GDP. But the growth rate of employment is misleading. During the initial period, that is after the introduction of the economic reforms, during the period of 93-94 to 99-2000, the growth rate of employment was 1.2%. But this growth rate of employment increased thereafter significantly to 2.8% per annum during the period 99-2000 to 2004-5. This increase of the employment growth was celebrated by the government as a success of the introduction of the liberalization policy in the Indian economy. But this high growth rate was short-lived. In the next period, Indian economy experienced very low growth rate of the economy, where the economy grows only at a rate of, where the employment of the economy increased at a rate of 0.2% per annum during 2004-5 to 2007-8. But during this period, the labor productivity, the growth of labor productivity and growth of per capita GDP was very, very high, or even highest in the last 2 decades, in these 2 decades of economic reforms. But the growth rate of labor productivity is relatively low. And in the next period, during the period of economic slowdown, the growth rate of employment was negative, that is minus 0.1. And in this period, this period is distinct because here the growth of labor productivity was higher than the growth rate of GDP. As a result, the growth rate of employment is negative. And in the next period, that is during 2019 19 to 11-12, the growth rate of employment also increased to 1.5%, and here the growth rate of labor productivity is relatively moderate. After this analyzing this trend, some of the researchers, they have argued that the growth of employment and growth of GDP are inversely related to each other, because the period where growth of employment is relatively low, and this particular period also the period where growth of output is relatively high. Therefore, they have argued that there is inverse relationship between growth of employment and growth of GDP. That is the theoretical relationship that we have explained earlier. Growth of employment is directly dependent on growth of output, not hold in our economy, in Indian economy. But another side of this logic is there. The story behind this logic is also related with the growth of labor productivity. If we see the growth of labor productivity, then it can be realized that the growth of labor productivity is the reason for the lower growth rate of employment. After analyzing the trend of growth of GDP, growth of labor productivity and growth of employment, we can conclude that the growth of labor productivity acts as a crucial factor to determine the growth rate of employment. Therefore, the direct relationship between growth of employment and growth of output not true in case of Indian economy. That is, higher growth rate of output creates higher growth of employment. This argument is not true, as it was evident from the empirical evidence of the Indian economy. And this argument also true if we look into the trend of the growth rate of output, growth rate of labor productivity and growth rate of employment during the next period, that is during 2011-12 to 2020-21. During this period, if we consider particular first sub-period, that is 2011-12 to 2017-18, then during this sub-period, the growth rate of GDP was very, very high, 8.4% per annum. Not only that, the growth rate of labor productivity was also higher than the growth rate of GDP, which was 8.9%. As a result, the growth rate of employment was negative during this period. But after 2017-18, there is the evidence of increase of the growth rate of employment in Indian economy because of the reduction of the growth rate of labor productivity as well as growth rate of GDP. And during the recent years, that is during 2018-19 to 1920 or even during 2019-20 to 2020-21, the growth rate of employment was relatively high. And in during this two period, the growth rate of labor productivity was negative, and during the next period, that is 2019-20 to 2020-21, growth rate of output is also relative. This negative growth of output due to the cause of the COVID-19 crisis due to COVID-19 pandemic. But during this period, growth rate of employment is positive. Now we come to section 5 that describes the trend of the growth rate of output and growth rate of employment across three broad sectors of the economy, that is across agriculture and allied sector, industry sector, and the service sector. If we consider the growth rate of GDP across these three sectors, then it is observed that the growth rate of GDP was relatively low in the agriculture sector compared to the industry and service sector. And in the particular period 2007-8 to 9-10, this year is distinct here because here agricultural growth rate is relatively low. It is less than 1%, which was 0.4%, and this low growth rate is due to the bad monsoon of the monsoon in the Indian economy, or that is due to the shortage of the rainfall. The agricultural growth was relatively low during this period. But the growth rate of employment was fluctuated from one year to another year, and this growth rate of employment was negative for agriculture sector since the year 2004-5. Section 6 deals with the output elasticity of employment, and this particular concept helps us to understand the nature of growth of the Indian economy. And this output elasticity of employment is measured by the ratio of the change of employment due to change of the output. Specifically, it can be measured as the percentage change of employment by percentage change of output, or it can be measured as the growth rate of employment by the growth rate of output. This particular indicator, which is termed here as output elasticity of employment, helps us to understand the nature of growth of the Indian economy, and accordingly we can classify the nature of growth into three categories. If the value of output elasticity of employment is less than 0, then the nature of growth is treated as the job loss growth. Here less than 0 means the value is negative. That means the growth rate of employment is negative due to the positive growth rate of output, and this phenomenon is treated as the job loss growth. There is no indication or no evidence of increase of the employment due to increase of the growth of GDP. Now, if the value of output elasticity of employment lies between 0 and 1, that is more than 0 and less than 1, then the nature of growth is treated as the jobless growth. For the values of output elasticity of employment less than 1 implies the growth rate of employment is lagging behind the growth rate of output. Therefore, the nature of growth is treated as jobless growth. But if the output elasticity of employment is more than 1, that means the growth rate of employment is higher than the growth rate of output, and accordingly the nature of growth is treated as the more job growth. Now we see what is the evidence of nature of growth in our economy. Before the empirical evidence, this particular indicator, that is output elasticity of employment, that help us to understand the nature of the growth, has some limitation. Here the limitations are arised due to mainly two reasons. First reason is that the relationship between growth of output and growth of employment is not unidirectional. Here we have considered growth of employment depends on growth of output, but the reverse may be true. where the growth of output also depends on the growth of employment, because employment is a crucial factor for the production of the output. Side by side, this relationship is true if we consider other restrictions such as technology, wage, and government policies. Otherwise, this relationship is not true. Whatever may be, but this particular indicator is crucial to understand the nature of the growth of Indian economy in respect of the change of the employment, or in respect of the employment sensitivity. This figure helps us to understand the nature of growth of the Indian economy during first 2 decades of the economic reforms. And this is actually the trend of the output elasticity of employment, and from diagram it is evident that the output elasticity of employment fluctuated from one year to another year, from one period to another period. During the period 93-94 to 99-2000, the value of output elasticity of employment was 0.15. But after that, because of the convergence of the growth rate of output and growth rate of labor productivity, this output elasticity of employment increased to 0.50 value. And in the next period, the output elasticity of employment decreased to 0.02, and during the period of economic slowdown, that is during the period of 2007-8 to 2009-10, the value of output elasticity of employment was negative due to the reason of the global financial crisis, implication of the global financial crisis. And in the next period, the output elasticity of employment also revived to 0.19. That is, during the entire period, the nature of the growth of Indian economy was jobless in nature, because the value lies between 0 and 1. The period 2007-8 to 2009-10 was distinct, because here the output elasticity of employment is less than 1. Therefore, this period is witnessed as job loss growth of the Indian economy. That is, during the period 2007-8 to 9-10, Indian economy has experienced a positive growth of output, but the growth rate of employment was negative during this period. This diagram shows the trend of employment elasticity of output, or output elasticity of employment, for the next 1 decade, that is starting from 2011-12 to 2020-21. And the nature of growth of Indian economy is also quite similar in the next period, that is 2011-12 to 2020-21. But the two periods, specifically 2008-9 to 19-20 and 2019-20 to 2021, are distinct, and because these periods are also related with the COVID-19 crisis, and therefore in the period 2008-19 to 19-20, the employment elasticity of output is more than 1, whereas during the latter period it is negative, and this is negative due to the negative growth rate of output in the Indian economy. Now, if we look into the nature of growth across 3 broad sectors of the Indian economy, that is across agriculture, industry and service sector, then it is also evident that the nature of growth is jobless in nature, and in agriculture sector also witnessed the job loss growth since the period 2004-5 onwards. After analyzing the trend of growth rate of output, growth rate of employment, and employment elasticity of output, we can conclude that the Indian economy has experienced the growth rate which is jobless or job loss in nature. But these are not the desired form of the growth rate, because Indian economy is an economy that is characterized by huge surplus employment. Therefore, the nature of growth rate must be, or nature of growth of employment must be higher compared to the growth rate of labor productivity, that help us to overcome the problem of unemployment. Therefore, we can expect that the nature of growth or nature of growth of employment would be productive and gainful. that can help to reduce the problem of unemployment and underemployment of Indian economy. Thank you.